Chapter 1. The perfect family. John Matthews was a man of stature in the small town of Riverbend. As a successful lawyer, he had built his career on hard work, integrity, and a deep commitment to his clients. His colleagues respected him, his clients trusted him, and his family adored him. To the outside world, John's life was perfect. He had a beautiful wife, Linda, who worked as a school principal, and a stepson, Adam, who had just turned 19. Adam was Linda's son from her first marriage. His biological father had passed away when Adam was just a child, leaving Linda to raise him alone until she met John. John had stepped into the role of father with ease, and over the years, he and Adam developed a close bond. They shared a love of sports, particularly basketball, and John had even coached Adam's high school team during his junior year. The two were often seen together around town, playing at the local courts or grabbing a burger at the diner. But behind closed doors, the reality of John's life was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. For the past year, John had been involved in a secret relationship with Adam. What had begun as innocent affection and bonding between stepfather and stepson had gradually transformed into something far more intense, something forbidden. Neither John nor Adam had planned for it to happen. It simply did. They both knew it was wrong, yet they couldn't stop. The relationship was hidden from Linda, from friends, from everyone. It was their secret, and the weight of it pressed down on John every single day. The secrecy, the guilt, and the fear of being discovered gnawed at John constantly. He was well aware of the consequences if anyone ever found out. His career, his marriage, his life, everything would be ruined. Yet, there was a part of him that was addicted to the risk, the thrill of it all. It made him feel alive in a way that nothing else did. Adam, on the other hand, was struggling. He had always looked up to John, admired his success, and respected his guidance. But as their relationship became more complicated, Adam's feelings became a tangled mess of confusion, guilt, and resentment. He felt trapped between his loyalty to his mother and his complicated feelings for John. As his 19th birthday approached, Adam began to distance himself from John, spending more time with his friends and less time at home. John noticed the change, and it scared him. He knew that Adam was pulling away, and he feared losing him. He couldn't bear the thought of Adam walking out of his life, not after everything they had been through together. But John didn't know how to stop it, how to keep Adam close without pushing him further away. The tension between them grew as the weeks passed. John became more controlling, more possessive, and Adam became more distant, more defiant. The once close bond they shared was unraveling, and neither of them knew how to mend it. The breaking point came one evening in late October. Linda was out of town at a school conference, leaving John and Adam alone in the house. The atmosphere was tense, and they had barely spoken to each other all day. As the evening wore on, John tried to engage Adam in conversation, but the boy was distant, responding in monosyllables and avoiding eye contact. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, John confronted Adam. "What's going on with you? Why are you avoiding me?" Adam looked at him, his expression conflicted. "I'm not avoiding you. I need some space, John. What we're doing, it's too much." John felt a surge of panic. "Adam, we've talked about this. We agreed that we could make this work, that we would keep it between us. I know, but it's not that simple. I can't keep living like this. I'm 19 now. I need to have my own life, my own relationships. I can't just be whatever this is with you." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. "Adam, please. You know I care about you. I can't lose you." Adam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not going to lose me, John. But we have to stop this. It's not healthy. It's not right." John's mind was racing. He couldn't lose Adam, not like this. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed Adam's arm. "Don't do this, Adam. We can work it out." Adam tried to pull away, but John's grip tightened. "Let go of me, John. I'm serious." But John wasn't thinking clearly. His emotions were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and desperation. He pulled Adam closer, his voice rising. "You can't just walk away from me." Adam shoved him hard. "I said, let go." The force of the shove sent John stumbling back, and something in him snapped. In that moment, all the fear, the guilt, the anger, it all came pouring out. Before he knew what he was doing, John lashed out, striking Adam across the face. Adam staggered, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected John to hit him, and for a moment, he was too stunned to react. But then the anger took over, and he launched himself at John, fists flying. The two of them grappled, struggling against each other in the small living room. Furniture was knocked over, pictures fell from the walls, and the sound of their scuffle filled the house. John was bigger, stronger, but Adam was younger, faster. It was a brutal, desperate fight, each of them driven by emotions they couldn't control. Finally, in a moment of blind rage, John managed to get the upper hand. He grabbed Adam by the throat, pinning him to the floor. "I told you, you're not leaving me," he shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. Adam struggled beneath him, but John's grip was like iron. The room seemed to spin as John squeezed, his mind a blur of rage and fear. He could feel Adam's resistance weakening, could see the life draining from his eyes, but he couldn't stop. All he could think about was the betrayal, the fear of losing everything he had. It wasn't until Adam went completely limp that John realized what he had done. He released his grip, staring down at Adam's lifeless body in horror. "Oh God! Oh my God!" he whispered, his hands trembling. John staggered back, his mind reeling. He had killed him. He had killed Adam. The boy he had raised, the boy he had loved. He was dead, and it was all John's fault. For a long moment, John just stood there, staring at Adam's body, unable to process what had just happened. Then, as the reality of it began to sink in, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before he vomited. When he finally pulled himself together, John knew he had to do something. He couldn't just leave Adam's body there. He had to cover it up, had to make it look like an accident. But even as he thought it, he knew it was pointless. The truth would come out eventually. It always did. Still, John had to try. He couldn't just give up. Not yet. Chapter 2. The cover-up. John's mind was racing as he tried to think of a plan. He knew he didn't have much time before Linda returned home. He needed to act quickly, but his thoughts were clouded by panic and guilt. He looked down at Adam's body, lying still on the living room floor. The sight of him, so lifeless and pale, sent another wave of nausea through John's body. But he forced himself to focus. He had to think rationally, had to figure out what to do next. First, he needed to move the body. He couldn't leave Adam there in the middle of the living room, where Linda would find him as soon as she walked through the door. John bent down and gently lifted Adam's body, struggling to suppress the tears that threatened to spill over. He carried him upstairs to his bedroom and laid him on the bed, covering him with a blanket. For a moment, John just stood there, looking down at Adam's face, as if expecting him to wake up. But he didn't. He never would. John wiped away the tears that had finally escaped and took a deep breath. He needed to get rid of any evidence that might link him to Adam's death. He quickly began cleaning up the living room, picking up the overturned furniture, and wiping away any traces of their struggle. As he worked, his mind kept racing back to that moment. The moment he had lost control and ended Adam's life. How could he have let it happen? How had he allowed things to spiral so far out of control? But it was too late for those questions now. All that mattered was covering up the crime. Once the living room was back in order, John moved on to the next step, creating an alibi. He needed to make it seem like Adam's death had been an accident or, better yet, like it had been someone else's doing. But how could he do that? What could he possibly say that would explain what had happened without implicating himself? John's mind was a blur as he tried to come up with a plan. He thought about staging a break-in, but that idea seemed too risky. What if the police found evidence that pointed back to him? What if they suspected him from the start? No, he needed something simpler, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Finally, an idea came to him. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could come up with under the circumstances. He would make it look like Adam had fallen down the stairs. It was a plausible explanation. People had accidents like that all the time. And if he staged it carefully, the police might just believe it. John hurried back upstairs to Adam's bedroom. He carefully picked up Adam's body once more and carried him to the top of the stairs. Then, with a heavy heart, He let go, letting the body tumble down the stairs, making sure it landed in a way that looked natural. But he stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking at Adam's lifeless form, and felt a cold chill run down his spine. It looked so real, so believable. But John knew it was all a lie. He quickly wiped down the banister and any surfaces that he might have touched, trying to eliminate any fingerprints or evidence that could tie him to the scene. He took a few deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to be calm, to think clearly if this was going to work. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "Hello, 911. What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. John took a deep breath, forcing himself to sound panicked and distraught. "My stepson, he's fallen down the stairs. He's not breathing. Please, you have to send someone, please." The operator's voice was calm and professional. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me your address?" John rattled off the address, his voice shaking. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Please hurry. I don't think he's breathing. Help is on the way, sir. Can you check if he has a pulse?" John knelt down beside Adam's body, pretending to check for a pulse he knew wasn't there. I don't feel anything," he lied. "Just stay on the line with me, sir. Help is coming." John stayed on the phone, his hands trembling as he tried to keep up the act. He knew he had to sell it, had to make them believe he was just a concerned stepfather who had come home to find his stepson dead at the bottom of the stairs. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and soon after, paramedics and police officers were rushing into the house. John stepped back, letting them do their work, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as they checked Adam's body, as they tried to revive him, but he knew it was no use. Adam was gone. The police quickly began asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened. John stuck to his story, telling them how he had come home to find Adam at the bottom of the stairs, how he had immediately called 911. He made sure to sound as convincing as possible, playing the part of the grieving stepfather. The police seemed to buy his story, at least at first. They noted down everything John told them, took pictures of the scene, and asked if there was anyone else in the house. John told them that Linda was out of town, that she wouldn't be back until the next day. The paramedics eventually confirmed what John already knew. Adam was dead. They covered his body with a sheet and began the process of moving him to the ambulance. As they wheeled Adam's body away, John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was it, the moment when everything would change. He had gotten away with it, at least for now, but the weight of what he had done was already starting to crush him. Chapter 3. The investigation. The days following Adam's death were a blur for John. The police conducted a routine investigation, interviewing him several times, but they seemed to believe his story. They had no reason to suspect foul play. After all, accidents happened all the time. Linda returned home the day after the incident, devastated by the news of her son's death. John did his best to comfort her, to be the supportive husband she needed during this difficult time. But every time she cried in his arms, every time she asked how it had happened, John felt a sickening sense of guilt. He was lying to her, deceiving her in the worst possible way. The funeral was held a week later. It was a small, somber affair, attended by close family and friends. Linda was inconsolable, and John played the part of the grieving stepfather perfectly, shedding tears and offering words of comfort to those who came to pay their respects. But inside, John was falling apart. The guilt, the fear, the horror of what he had done, it was all consuming him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adam's lifeless face, heard the sound of his body tumbling down the stairs. It was driving him mad. As the weeks passed, the police investigation came to a close. They had found no evidence of foul play, and the case was officially ruled as an accidental death. John should have felt relieved, but instead, he felt even more trapped. He had gotten away with murder, but at what cost? Linda began to suspect that something was wrong with John. He was distant, withdrawn, barely speaking to her. She tried to reach out, tried to get him to open up, but he always brushed her off, claiming that he was just tired, that he was still grieving. But Linda wasn't convinced. She knew her husband, and she knew when something was wrong. She started watching him more closely, paying attention to the way he acted, the way he spoke. And the more she watched, the more she began to see the cracks in his facade. One evening, after Linda had gone to bed, John sat alone in the living room, staring at the television but not really watching it. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the memories of that terrible night, but he didn't hear Linda come down the stairs until she was standing right behind him. "John," she said softly. John jumped, startled by her sudden appearance. "Linda, you scared me." "I'm sorry," she said, sitting down beside him. I wanted to talk to you." John could feel his heart starting to race. "About what?" "About Adam. About what happened." John swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've already talked about this, Linda. It was an accident." "I know," she said, her voice filled with sadness. "But I've been thinking, something doesn't feel right, John. Something about the way it all happened." John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Linda admitted. "It's just a feeling I have. Like there's something you're not telling me." John's mind was racing. He had to stay calm, had to keep up the act. "Linda, I swear, I've told you everything. It was just a horrible accident." But Linda didn't seem convinced. She looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. "Are you sure, John? Are you sure there's nothing else?" John felt like he was about to break. He wanted to confess, to tell her everything, but he knew he couldn't. It would destroy her, destroy everything they had built together. He had to keep lying, had to keep the truth buried deep inside. "I'm sure," he said, forcing himself to sound convincing. "Please, Linda, you have to believe me." Linda stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Okay, John, I believe you." But the doubt in her eyes told him otherwise. That as the days turned into weeks, John's guilt continued to eat away at him. He couldn't escape the memories, couldn't escape the feeling that everything was closing in on him. He began to withdraw even further, avoiding Linda, avoiding everyone. He spent most of his time locked away in his office, trying to drown out his thoughts with work, but nothing could silence the voices in his head. Then, one day, the phone rang. It was Detective Smith, the lead investigator on Adam's case. "Mr. Matthews, I need to speak with you," Smith said, his tone serious. John felt his heart skip a beat. "Is something wrong?" "There's something I need to discuss with you in person," Smith replied. "Can you come down to the station?" John's mind raced as he agreed to meet with the detective. What could this be about? Had they found something? Had they discovered the truth? When John arrived at the station, Smith was waiting for him. The detective led him into a small interrogation room and offered him a seat. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Matthews," Smith said, sitting down across from him. "I wanted to speak with you about Adam's case." John forced himself to stay calm. "I thought the case was closed?" "It was," Smith admitted. "But something came up during our routine follow-up. It's probably nothing, but I wanted to run it by you." John's heart was pounding in his chest. "What is it?" Smith leaned forward, his eyes fixed on John's. "One of our forensic analysts was reviewing the case file, and they noticed something unusual. There were some bruises on Adam's body that didn't quite match up with the fall down the stairs. They were more consistent with a struggle." John felt a wave of panic wash over him. He could barely breathe, barely think. "A struggle?" he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. Smith nodded. "I know this is difficult to hear, but we have to explore every possibility. Is there anything you can tell me that might explain those bruises?" John was trapped. He knew there was no way out of this. No way to explain the bruises without implicating himself. But he couldn't confess. Not now. Not after everything he had done to cover it up. "I don't know," John stammered, trying to come up with something, anything. Maybe he fell and hit something on the way down." Smith didn't look convinced. "That's possible, but we need to be thorough. We'll be conducting a more detailed examination of the evidence. I just wanted to give you a heads up." John nodded, barely able to keep his composure. "I understand." Smith stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Matthews. We'll be in touch if we find anything else." John left the station in a daze, his mind spinning with fear and panic. They were going to find out. They were going to discover the truth. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 4. The unraveling. The next few days were a living nightmare for John. He was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every unexpected knock on the door. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the truth creeping closer and closer to the surface. Linda noticed his growing anxiety and tried to comfort him, but her presence only made things worse. Every time she looked at him, he felt like she could see right through him, like she knew the truth but was waiting for him to admit it. John couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, the constant paranoia, it was all too much. He started drinking heavily, trying to numb the pain, but it only made things worse. The alcohol didn't drown out the memories. It only amplified them, making them more vivid, more unbearable. One night, after downing half a bottle of whiskey, John stumbled into the living room, his mind a blur of alcohol and self-loathing. He sat down on the couch and buried his face in his hands, trying to block out the images of Adam's lifeless body, the sound of his voice pleading with him to stop. But the memories wouldn't go away. They haunted him, tormenting him, driving him closer and closer to the edge that he didn't know how long he sat there, lost in his own misery. But eventually, he heard a voice. At first, he thought it was just another hallucination, another figment of his tortured mind. But then he realized it was real. John. He looked up and saw Linda standing in the doorway, her face etched with concern. John, what's wrong? He wanted to tell her, wanted to confess everything, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't destroy her like that. Nothing, he mumbled, reaching for the bottle of whiskey. Just leave me alone. But Linda didn't leave. She walked over to him and gently took the bottle from his hand, setting it aside. John, please. Talk to me. He couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the guilt, the lies, it was all too much. He felt like he was going to explode. Why can't you just leave me alone? He snapped, his voice filled with anger and desperation. Linda flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she didn't back down. Because I love you, John, and I know something is wrong. I'm worried about you. Her words cut through him like a knife. How could she still love him after everything he had done? How could she still care about him when he was nothing but a monster? I don't deserve your love, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Linda frowned, not understanding. What are you talking about? John shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't hold it in any longer. The guilt, the pain, the shame, it all came pouring out in a torrent of sobs. I killed him, Linda, he choked out, his voice breaking. I killed Adam. Linda stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. What are you saying? John couldn't stop the words now, couldn't stop the confession that had been building inside him for weeks. It was an accident, I swear. I didn't mean to do it. But we were arguing, and I lost control. I didn't mean to hurt him, but I did. I killed him. Linda's face went pale, her hands trembling as she took a step back. No, that can't be true. You're lying. John shook his head, the tears streaming down his face. I wish I was Linda, but it's true. I killed him, and then I tried to cover it up. I made it look like an accident, but it wasn't. It was my fault. Linda stumbled back, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted. How could he have done this? How could he have killed her son? No, this can't be happening, she whispered, her voice trembling. But John knew there was no turning back now. He had confessed, and there was no undoing what he had done. I'm so sorry, Linda, he sobbed, his heart breaking. I'm so sorry. But Linda couldn't hear him. She was too consumed by the horror of the truth, the unbearable pain of losing her son to the man she had loved. Without another word, she turned and fled the room, leaving John alone with his guilt, his shame, and the crushing weight of his confession. Chapter 5. The consequences. Linda didn't return home that night. She couldn't. She couldn't face John, couldn't face the reality of what he had done. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the streets of Riverbend, her mind a chaotic mess of grief, anger, and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could she have been so blind, so foolish? She had trusted John, had loved him, had believed in him, but he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. He had killed her son. By the time the sun began to rise, Linda had made up her mind. She couldn't stay in Riverbend any longer. She couldn't stay in the house where Adam had died, where John had killed him. She needed to leave, needed to get as far away from the memories, from the pain, from the man who had destroyed her life, She drove back to the house, careful not to wake John as she quietly packed a bag with her essentials. She couldn't bear to see him, couldn't bear to face him after what he had done. She left a note on the kitchen table, explaining that she was leaving and that she needed time to process everything. She didn't know if she would ever come back. And then she was gone. John woke up late that morning, his head pounding from the hangover and the emotional breakdown from the night before. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, that he hadn't really confessed to Linda, that Adam was still alive, that everything was still normal. But the sight of Linda's empty side of the bed quickly brought him back to reality. She was gone, and she knew the truth. John dragged himself out of bed and went downstairs, hoping to find Linda in the kitchen. But instead, he found her note. His heart sank as he read her words, as he realized she had left him. He had lost her, just like he had lost Adam. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. For a long time, John just stood there, staring at the note, the weight of his actions crushing him from all sides. He had destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, his life. And now, there was nothing left. He didn't know how long he stood there. But eventually, he heard a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat as he realized who it must be: the police. They had come for him. John didn't try to resist as he opened the door and saw Detective Smith standing there with two uniformed officers. He didn't even flinch as they informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Adam. He just nodded numbly, allowing them to handcuff him and lead him out of the house. There was no point in fighting it, no point in denying what he had done. He had confessed, and now he would face the consequences. That as they drove him to the police station, John couldn't help but think about everything he had lost, everything he had thrown away. He had once been a respected lawyer, a loving husband, a caring stepfather. But now, he was nothing more than a murderer. The trial was a short one. John's confession had been recorded, and the evidence was overwhelming. He didn't even try to defend himself. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, knowing that he deserved whatever punishment the court decided to give him. The sentencing was the final blow: 25 years to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. John felt a strange sense of relief as the sentence was handed down. At least now, he would pay for what he had done. At least now, there would be some form of justice for Adam. Linda never came to visit him. She never contacted him, never sent a letter, never even acknowledged his existence again. John didn't blame her. He knew that she was better off without him, that she deserved a chance to heal, to move on, to find some semblance of peace. That as John settled into his life in prison, he tried to come to terms with what he had done. He attended therapy sessions, spoke to counselors, and did everything he could to make amends for the horrible crime he had committed. But no matter what he did, the guilt never went away. The memories of that night haunted him. The sound of Adam's voice pleading with him, the sight of his lifeless body at the bottom of the stairs. It was a burden he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And as the years passed, John found himself wondering if there was any way he could ever truly atone for what he had done. Could he ever find redemption? Could he ever forgive himself? The answer, he knew, was no. What he had done was unforgivable. He had taken an innocent life, and nothing he could do would ever change that. But even so, John continued to try. He continued to seek redemption, continued to search for some form of peace, even if he knew deep down that it would always be out of his reach. Because in the end, John Matthews knew that he deserved to suffer. He deserved to live with the guilt, the pain, the memories. He deserved to pay the price for the life he had taken, for the lives he had destroyed. And that, he knew, was his true punishment. A punishment far worse than any prison sentence. Epilogue. The aftermath: years passed, and life in Riverbend moved on. The story of John Matthews and the tragic death of Adam became a distant memory, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones around dinner tables and at local bars. Linda never returned to Riverbend. She moved to a new city, started a new life, trying to leave the past behind. But the pain of losing Adam, of discovering the truth about John, was something she could never fully escape. It haunted her, just as it haunted John, a ghost that lingered in the corners of her mind, in the shadows of her dreams. She never remarried. The idea of trusting someone, of opening her heart to someone again, was too terrifying, too painful. Instead, she dedicated her life to her work, to helping the children at her school, to making sure that no one else would ever suffer the way she had today. As for John, his life in prison was a lonely one. He kept to himself, avoided trouble, spent his days in quiet reflection. He became known among the other inmates as the man who never spoke, who never smiled, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And in a way, he did. John never applied for parole. He knew he didn't deserve it. He knew that the only way he could ever begin to atone for his sins was to spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying the price for the life he had taken. And so, he did that. In the end, John Matthews died alone in his prison cell, an old man with nothing left but his memories, his guilt, and the knowledge that he had destroyed everything that had ever mattered to him. But in his final moments, as he lay on the cold, hard cot, staring up at the ceiling, John felt a strange sense of peace. He had paid his debt, had faced the consequences of his actions, had lived with the guilt, the pain, the memories, and now, finally, it was over. As the darkness closed in around him, John closed his eyes and whispered a single word: sorry. And with that, John Matthews, the man who had once had it all, who had once been loved and respected, who had once been a husband, a father, a lawyer, took his final breath and slipped away into the abyss, leaving behind a world that would never remember his name, a world that had moved on without him, a world that was better off without him. Because in the end, that was all he deserved.